Good evening, and welcome to the Night Owl. And happy October. We are moving through this month at a very speeded rate, and as sad as I am to see the month nearing its end, I'm also excited because, hey, it's Halloween season, baby. And if you're new to the podcast, well, this is the other side of the Bird Brain podcast where the things that go bump in the night have a little bit more freedom to roam and walk around. Okay, but I must warn you, content may contain adult language and scenarios that may not be suitable for all audience members, so listeners' discretion is always advised. It's so interesting when we have a very colorful history because sometimes it's not just the experiences that we revisit, but we also may run into people, places, and things from the past as well. And not everything is something worth revisiting. Lock your doors, check your windows, and get comfortable. You won't be sleeping tonight. I give you the Running Man. My grandparents are genuinely some of the coolest people I know. They're wise, they're funny as hell, and they are some solid storytellers. They've been through a lot, to say the least. I spent a decent amount of time with them because my folks worked all the time. And it's not like my parents needed to work, but I think they were avoiding one another. I'm grateful for my grandfolks since them being there made my bro and I feel like we weren't uncared for. They did their best to distract us from whatever was happening between my mom and my dad. But like they say, kids are sponges, and you don't always have to say the truth out loud for them to hear it. Both of them were high powered attorneys, my mom and dad. Both very good people, but both just bad at loving each other. I guess that's the best way to put it. And if I'm being honest, I don't regret the cards that I was dealt. My grandma and pa were some of the sweetest people I know. I cooked with my grandpa. I built stuff and fixed things with my grandma. I gardened with the both of them. And my favorite time was always the stories. They'd been together for forever, but they were still very young. And they also grew up at an interesting time in history, too. They were both spies during one of the wars. How badass, right? They met randomly at some coffee shop, though. Not on the clock, but clocking one another, obviously. Your grandpa had a hole in his face, apparently. That was my grandma, referring to the fact that every day he'd get coffee, and every day the coffee ended up on his shirt. They didn't know they'd been watching the same person, and one thought that the other was the culprit. That's how we kind of met. A whole year. A whole year they didn't approach one another. But they watched each other for that time. But there was always this one story that they told that gave me and my brother the goosebumps. It was a night they'd been in Paris. Both were walking on a cobblestone street, and there were a couple of street lights illuminating the street, but not too many. Just light enough, but just dark enough for anything that wanted to take a stroll with them. My grandma was heading back to her flat, and thought she saw my grandpa jogging towards her. Up until this point, they've had some secret visits, but she couldn't be too sure. I saw him running a couple of times throughout the time I spent in Paris, and he'd always run past my window just to let me know he was around. It was our way of communicating. But this time it had been different. The man saw me. He stood under the street light to cloak himself. I stood at the far end of the other side of the street, since I just assumed your grand was trying to be all mysterious and romantic. So I waited. And that's when he slowly started walking towards me. Then it became a jog. And then a full-on run. I didn't feel right once I saw him running towards me, because that wasn't your grandpa's stride. And that's the same time your grandpa used to run. But I realized it wasn't him. I do draw a blank after a certain point in that, because I was so shocked. The next thing I remember, your grandfather and I were sitting in my room, and the police were present, and they were asking us questions. But we couldn't tell them too much. It was a secret. People talked about a running man that they saw in Paris at night. And apparently, the people that saw him didn't live to tell about it, because there was always a body that turned up the following day. At that point in time in history, jogging was a thing, but it wasn't as common as it is now. But every time they told that story, I saw the color leave both of their faces. It was as if they knew something that they weren't telling us. And a part of me wondered a lot. Eventually, they stopped seeing the Paris runner, is what we'll call him. And a part of me wondered if they had something to do with it. In my imagination as a kid, and even as a teenager, I started to wonder who my grandparents really were. What kind of spies? How dangerous were they? They always seemed so happy, but they were also very skilled. You know, they say sometimes the past comes back to haunt you. But I didn't think that this mattered too much, because it was so long ago for them, and they were so young. So I thought. And then it was this one night. Once again, my parents worked late, so my brother and I decided to spend the weekend with my grandfolks. And there was one night I was in the garage locking up when I saw someone on their street jogging. And this was a quiet street, a few street lights here and there. It's almost like the street that my grandparents described. But I saw this jogger, and they stopped at the far end of a street, under a street light, and they paused. But then they started walking, and then they started running. But before they could get to me, I closed the garage door. I just assumed my mind was playing tricks on me, until I saw my brother. And he told me he saw some guy standing under the light looking up. When we told our grandparents what it was, you would think they both saw a ghost. They played it off like they usually do. But I recognized they didn't really want to draw attention to something else. So I did some research myself. There was a running man in Paris. They called him a hero, because people were turning up missing around the same time my grandparents were there. So something didn't make sense. But I realized when my grandparents left Paris, the running man also went missing too. It's hard to say what the full truth is, but I will tell you this. There have been a lot of nights I've seen somebody running past this house. And I've heard stories about how ghosts will sometimes haunt a place, or sometimes haunt a person, especially when there's some unfinished business. So there you have it. Tune in next week for another story to keep you up at night. And as we count down to Halloween, in a very special episode for you guys. But in the meantime, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and sleep tight.